fog had a way of softening the world, blurring the lines between what was gone and what still lingered. That morning in Seattle, it hung low over the rooftops, quiet as breath. Inside a small apartment on the fourth floor, Nora Bennett sat by the window, brush in hand, staring at a canvas that refused to come alive. Her paints had dried, her rent was late, and the silence, it was the kind that echoed off the walls and came back heavier. She'd once dreamed of galleries, of color and light, but lately, all she painted was gray. Every stroke felt like a whisper to a life that had forgotten her name. Then, somewhere between the hum of the city and the ticking of a tired clock, her laptop pinged, an email unexpected, almost unreal, an invitation from a remote estate on the coast of Maine, a job that promised enough money to change everything, but required her to live in complete isolation, inside a mansion that hadn't heard laughter in years. Nora hesitated, staring at the screen as rain began to fall against the glass. She didn't know yet that beyond that misty road, someone else was waiting, a man haunted by his own silence, and a love he'd buried long ago. And soon, their worlds would collide beneath the same gray sky. The morning light in Seattle never really arrived. It drifted in softly, like a ghost unsure of being welcome. It touched the edge of a window, streaked with yesterday's rain, and settled on the face of a woman bent over a canvas. Nora Bennett, 29, a painter of places no one paid much attention to. Empty fields, quiet roads, skies that always looked like they were about to cry. The sound of her brush dragging across the canvas mixed with the faint ticking of a wall clock. Each second sounded louder than the last, as if time itself was reminding her of what she hadn't done. Rent due, electricity bill waiting, gallery email still unanswered. She dipped the brush into a jar of cloudy water, stared at the swirl of faded color, and whispered to herself, it used to be brighter than this. Outside, the fog pressed against the window like a living thing, wrapping the whole city in gray. Seattle had its beauty, yes, but it was a beauty that could swallow you whole. Nora stood, stretching her back, her hands cold from hours without moving. On the small table beside her, half a bagel sat untouched next to an old coffee mug with a chipped rim. She took a sip, cold, bitter, familiar. Her phone buzzed, a notification from her landlord, polite but pointed. She sighed, turned it face down, and walked to the window. Below, people hurried through the mist with umbrellas like dark flowers blooming and closing with each gust of wind. She painted them, sometimes strangers moving through rain, but the paintings never sold. Too quiet, a gallery owner once told her. People like color, drama, movement. Nora had smiled and nodded, but deep down she knew she couldn't paint noise. Only stillness. She had grown used to quiet. After her parents divorced when she was 17, silence became her safest companion. It never asked, never judged. But lately, even silence had started to feel heavy, like a weight she carried from one day into the next. At noon, she pulled on an old cardigan and stepped outside. The air smelled of wet concrete and pine. A block away, a small cafe buzzed with the hum of espresso machines and distant laughter. Nora took her usual seat near the window, sketchbook open, pencil ready. She drew the same thing she always did, the outline of a house by a lake she'd never been to. It wasn't real, but it felt like home. A couple at the next table was arguing quietly. Something about a vacation, or the lack of one. The man's voice was clipped. The woman's eyes looked tired. Nora glanced at them briefly, then back to her sketch. Two figures by the lake now, one standing, one leaving. Her pencil paused. She closed the book. As she walked back to her apartment, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of salt, unusual for a city miles from the ocean. She stopped, tilted her head, and listened. Somewhere, a train horn sounded in the distance, long and low. It reminded her of nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would be like to start over somewhere else. Back home, The apartment felt smaller than before. Paint tubes scattered across the floor, canvases leaning against the wall, a single lamp throwing yellow light onto everything. Her life fit neatly into 500 square feet, and yet it felt too big, too empty. Nora sat at her desk and opened her laptop. No new commissions, no emails from galleries, only bills and newsletters she didn't remember subscribing to. She almost closed the lid when a new message appeared, a name she didn't recognize. Ashford Heritage Trust. For a moment, she thought it was spam, but the subject line caught her eye: Restoration Project, Confidential Offer. She hesitated, then clicked. A short, formal message unfolded on the screen. They were looking for a visual artist to assist in restoring the gardens and artwork of Ashford Hall, an old estate near the coast of Maine. Room and board included, 3 months of work, generous compensation. She read it twice, then a third time. There had to be a mistake. She'd never applied for anything like this. Maybe it was sent to the wrong person, but at the bottom of the message, her name was there, typed neatly: Ms. Nora Bennett. Her heart beat faster. For years, she had dreamed of leaving the city not to escape, but to breathe. And yet, now that the chance had arrived, her first instinct was disbelief. Who in Maine even knew she existed? She leaned back in her chair, staring at the email until the words blurred. Outside, the fog thickened again, swallowing the buildings across the street. She felt the same way halfway between seen and unseen, real and fading. The next morning, she took the long bus route by the harbor, sketching strangers on the way, a fisherman mending his net, a woman feeding gulls, a child pressing his hand against the foggy glass, leaving a small, perfect print. She smiled softly. Sometimes, she thought, beauty didn't need to shout. It only needed someone willing to notice. By evening, her apartment was cold again. She turned on the small heater, watched its orange glow flicker, and opened the email once more. A part of her wanted to delete it to stay where things were predictable, even if lonely, but another part, the part that still believed in second chances, whispered, maybe this is how something begins. She looked around the room, the unfinished canvases, the cracked mug, the quiet. Seattle had given her gray skies and survival, but she longed for color, for air that didn't taste of exhaustion. With a deep breath, she hit reply. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing 3 simple words. I'm interested. Please tell me more. When she pressed send, a strange calm settled over her. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing a sliver of pale light over the sound. It wasn't much, just a thin line of silver between clouds, but for the first time in months, Nora felt it something quiet and alive, beginning to move. The rain had not stopped since dawn. It slid down the window in thin silver lines, tracing the same tired path again and again. Nora sat at her desk, chin resting on her palm, watching droplets merge and fall like thoughts she couldn't quite hold on to. The apartment was dim, filled only with the hum of the heater and the soft rustle of her cat rubbing against the leg of her chair. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept circling back to that email from the night before. Ashford Heritage Trust, 3 months, a restoration project, a payment that seemed impossible for someone like her. She had reread it until the words lost meaning, until they became nothing more than shapes on a glowing screen. Now, in the gray of morning, it still didn't feel real. She opened her laptop again, half expecting the message to have vanished overnight, like a dream that didn't want to be remembered. But it was still there, patient and waiting. The subject line blinked quietly. Regarding your interest in Ashford Hall. She clicked. The reply was brief, formal, written in the kind of tone that made her sit up straighter. They had reviewed her portfolio and believed her work matched the spirit of the estate. Ashford Hall, the letter read, was once the home of the late photographer Evelyn Ashford. Her gardens and visual works have fallen into disrepair. We seek an artist capable of restoring their essence. Room and board provided. The only condition: full residency during the project. No outside contact for the duration. Nora scrolled back to the beginning and read the lines again. The words "no outside contact" caught at something inside her. 3 months alone. It sounded like both a promise and a warning. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling where faint shadows shifted with the light. She imagined the estate a mansion by a lake, hidden behind old iron gates, maybe surrounded by pine and mist. It felt distant, almost unreal, yet her heart beat faster at the thought. Outside, a siren wailed far away. A bus splashed through a puddle. The city carried on without her. She whispered to herself, "What am I even thinking?" But a quiet voice beneath the doubt answered, "Maybe you just need to go." By noon, she had sent her official confirmation. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked send. The reply came within an hour, almost as if they had been waiting. A man named Thomas Gray from the trust attached travel details, a contract, and a digital ticket to Bangor, Maine. She was to arrive in 2 days. Someone would pick her up at the station and drive her to the property. 2 days? It felt impossibly soon. She stood in the middle of her apartment, looking at her life, the canvases stacked against the wall, the chipped mug on the table, the plants that never quite thrived in the weak Seattle sun. How do you pack up loneliness, she thought? How do you leave behind something that never really held you? She pulled out a small suitcase from under her bed. Inside, she found her old sketchbook from college, its corners worn and pages yellowed. She traced her name on the cover, written in pencil years ago. It felt like touching a younger version of herself, the one who still believed art could change the world. As she folded her clothes, the rain finally eased. A thin beam of light slipped through the clouds, landing across her half-finished painting on the easel. It was of a garden, wild and overgrown, painted from imagination. She stared at it for a long time. Something about it felt prophetic, like she had been painting a place she hadn't yet seen. That night, sleep came slowly. She dreamed of water, the endless reflection of gray skies, of footsteps echoing down long, empty halls, of a man's silhouette framed by light and shadow. His face she couldn't see, but she felt the weight of his gaze. When she woke, her heart was still racing. Morning came too early. The suitcase waited by the door. She made one last cup of coffee, leaning against the counter as she drank it. Outside, the city looked softer, forgiving even. The bus ride to the station felt quieter than usual. Every street corner looked like it was saying goodbye. At the ticket counter, the clerk smiled as he printed her pass. Maine? Huh. You'll like it there. Peaceful. Nora smiled faintly. That's what I'm afraid of. On the train, the landscape unfolded slowly. The concrete gave way to trees, the sound of traffic replaced by the steady rhythm of wheels on steel. Miles and miles of open land passed by, fields touched by mist, rivers curling like ribbons of glass. It felt as if the world was leading her somewhere she was meant to find. By the second day, the air changed. It smelled different, cleaner, colder, edged with pine. When she stepped off at the small station in Maine, the sky hung low, pale and silver. A man in a dark coat stood by an old black car, holding a sign with her name. "Ms. Bennett?" he asked. His voice was polite, distant. "I'm here to take you to Ashford Hall." The drive was long and winding. The road narrowed as they climbed toward higher ground. Through the window, Nora saw the faint shimmer of a lake, wide and still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. The trees grew thicker, the world quieter. The driver spoke only once. "Not many visitors go up there anymore," he said. "The place hasn't had company in years." She nodded but said nothing. Her hands were clasped together in her lap, fingers cold. When the car turned onto a gravel path, she saw it at last, the wrought iron gate, half rusted, standing before a long, sloping drive. Beyond it, through the veil of fog, rose the outline of a house, massive, timeless, watching. Her breath caught. For reasons she couldn't name, it felt as though the place had been waiting for her. The driver opened her door and gestured toward the entrance. "Someone will meet you inside," he said. Nora stood there for a moment, suitcase in hand, the mist brushing her face like a whisper. The air smelled faintly of rain and cedar. She took one slow breath, her heart beating steady, uncertain. Then she stepped forward, past the gate, into the silence that would change everything. Somewhere deep within the house, a light flickered on. The iron gate groaned as it opened, slow and heavy, like something waking from a long sleep. Beyond it, a narrow road climbed gently upward through a tunnel of trees, their wet branches bowing low, shedding drops that glimmered like glass beads in the fog. Nora followed the driver's gesture and stepped through, her suitcase bumping softly against her leg. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. The mist thickened as she climbed, wrapping around her until the rest of the world seemed to disappear. When the house finally came into view, she stopped. Ashford Hall rose from the hill like a monument half forgotten by time. The stone walls were streaked with moss, the windows tall and dark, some of them still shuttered. A single light glowed faintly behind an upper window, the only sign that someone still lived here. It looked less like a home and more like a memory someone had built and then abandoned halfway through. The driver lifted her suitcase from the car, placed it by the front steps, and tipped his hat. "Welcome to Ashford Hall, Ms. Bennett. Someone will see to you shortly." His voice sounded distant in the damp air. By the time she turned to thank him, the car was already reversing down the hill, headlights swallowed by fog. For a long moment, Nora stood alone, listening. There was no sound except the faint rustle of wind through the pines and the slow drip of water from the eaves. The silence was not empty, it was watchful, almost alive. She climbed the steps and reached for the brass door knocker, its surface cool and rough beneath her hand. The echo that followed when she struck it seemed to travel endlessly through the house, bouncing off distant walls before fading. Seconds passed. Then the door creaked open. A woman stood there, perhaps in her 60s, wearing a gray cardigan buttoned all the way to her neck. Her hair was neatly pinned, her face calm but unreadable. "Ms. Bennett," she said. "You're expected." Her accent held a trace of New England, softened by years of restraint. "Yes," Nora answered, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm here for the restoration project." The woman nodded once. "I'm Mrs. Helen Moore, the housekeeper. Follow me, please." Inside, the air felt colder, older. The entrance hall was vast, with a staircase that swept upward into shadow. Dust floated in the pale light spilling from high windows. The floorboards creaked under Nora's feet as they walked. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of people whose faces were both familiar and strange, as if she might have seen them once in a dream. Helen's footsteps were steady. "You'll find the staff quarters at the back of the east wing. Meals are served twice a day. Breakfast at 8, supper at 7. You'll meet Mr. Ashford tomorrow. He prefers not to be disturbed after dark." "Mr. Ashford?" The name alone seemed to shift the air. Nora nodded, though she wasn't sure what to say. They passed a long hallway where dust sheets covered the furniture like ghosts at rest. A single grandfather clock ticked faintly near the end, its pendulum swinging with slow patience. Helen stopped by a tall door and pushed it open. "This will be your room. Heat takes time to travel through the pipes, so there's an extra blanket in the wardrobe. You'll find your instructions for the garden project on the desk." The room was modest but beautiful in a worn kind of way. A bed with an iron frame, a window overlooking the lake below, its surface rippling under a veil of mist. Nora set her suitcase down and ran her fingers along the edge of the wooden desk. The grain was rough, but real like everything else here. "Thank you," she said softly. Helen gave a small nod and turned to leave, pausing only once. "This house can be unsettling at first. It remembers things. Don't let it frighten you." Then she closed the door behind her. For a moment, Nora simply stood there, listening to the echo of that sentence. It remembers things. She crossed to the window. The lake stretched out below, like a mirror reflecting nothing. Beyond it, the forest rose dark and still. Somewhere out there, a bird cried once sharp, lonely, and then silence again. Nora unpacked slowly, a few sweaters, her sketchbook, a small wooden box of paints, worn smooth from years of use. She placed them carefully on the desk, her tiny claim of life inside this sleeping house. Later, as dusk fell, she explored a little. The hallways were long, the ceilings high, every corner filled with shadows that seemed to breathe. She passed a parlor where old photographs hung crooked on the wall, one of them showing a woman standing in sunlight, a camera slung around her neck. Evelyn Ashford, she guessed. The woman whose name still lingered here like perfume, long faded but not gone. Something in the photo held her, the way Evelyn smiled, not at the camera, but through it, as if she was seeing something beyond. Nora felt an ache in her chest, that strange recognition when one artist glimpses another's longing. She whispered under her breath, "What did you see here?" Evelyn, but her voice was too small to fill the space. She wandered toward the main hall again. A door stood ajar near the staircase, and from inside came the faint scent of smoked firewood, maybe, or something older. She hesitated, then peeked in. It was a library, tall shelves reaching all the way to the ceiling, lined with books thick with dust. A fireplace smoldered quietly in the corner, the only source of warmth she'd felt since arriving. Then she heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. A figure stood near the far side of the room, half in shadow, tall, shoulders slightly bowed, as if carrying something too heavy to put down. He turned just enough for the firelight to catch his face, gray eyes, pale skin, expression unreadable. "Mr. Ashford," she murmured, before realizing she hadn't meant to say it aloud. He didn't answer, just looked at her for a moment, longer than was comfortable. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared through a side door. Nora stood there, pulse quickening. There was something in his silence, something not cold, exactly, but restrained, like a man who had forgotten how to speak gently. The clock on the mantel ticked once, then again. She stepped closer to the fire, letting its warmth reach her hands. The flames moved softly, their glow brushing across the spines of unread books, the worn rug, the edges of her shoes. When she finally returned to her room, the house was utterly quiet again. She sat by the window, looking out at the lake. The fog had thinned just enough to reveal a faint silver shimmer on the water's surface. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked as if someone else, too, was awake, listening. She whispered to herself, "This place, it feels alive." And as the clock struck 10, Nora felt the faintest breath of air against her cheek, like someone had just walked past her. The morning mist hadn't lifted when Nora first saw him clearly. Ethan Ashford stood near the terrace that overlooked the lake, his back straight, his posture too composed for someone who lived surrounded by silence. He was taller than she'd imagined the night before, the kind of man who seemed to hold the weather around him gray, still, distant. His hands were tucked into the pockets of a dark coat, his gaze fixed on the water below, as if he were waiting for it to answer a question. Nora hesitated at the threshold, unsure if she should speak. The soft crunch of gravel beneath her boots must have given her away, because he turned. His face was handsome in a quiet, severe way, like the lines of a building designed more for endurance than beauty. There was no greeting, no smile. Just those eyes, pale as winter light, measuring her from a distance. "You must be Ms. Bennett," he said at last. His voice was low, even, but carried the weight of someone who had not spoken much in a long time. "Yes," she answered. "Thank you for having me." He gave a small nod. "Helen told me you arrived safely. I trust the accommodations are adequate." "They're perfect," Nora said. Though the truth was, the room had felt like sleeping inside a whisper. "Good." He paused, as if deciding whether to continue. "Before you begin your work, there are a few rules you need to understand." She waited, folding her hands together to keep from fidgeting. "First," he said, "Ashford Hall is a private residence. I expect quiet, no unnecessary noise. The grounds carry sound farther than you think." Nora nodded. "Second," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You are not to inquire about anything that doesn't concern your project. There are parts of this estate that are closed, and matters of the past that are not open for discussion. You will have full access to the garden and adjoining studios nowhere else." He spoke the words with precision, like a man drawing boundaries on a map. "I understand," she said, though a small part of her bristled at the sharpness in his tone. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint call of a loon across the water. Ethan turned back toward the lake. "Helen will show you the garden this afternoon. Begin wherever you think best. I don't interfere with artistic process." "Thank you," she said softly. He gave another short nod and started toward the house. At the doorway, he stopped, his voice quiet but firm. "And Ms. Bennett, the fewer questions you ask, the easier your stay will be." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. Nora let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The air around her seemed to settle again, heavy with unspoken things. She turned toward the lake. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the pale outline of the house above it. The reflection looked almost identical, except in the mirrored image. The windows seemed darker. She wrapped her arms around herself and whispered, "No questions." Right. But questions were already blooming in her mind like seeds under frost. By afternoon, the clouds began to break apart, revealing slivers of sunlight that caught on the dew-covered branches. Helen met her by the side path, a set of old iron keys jingling softly in her hand. "Mr. Ashford mentioned the rules," Helen said, her tone neutral. "He did." Nora replied, "Seems like he values peace and privacy." The housekeeper gave a faint smile, more weary than kind. "He values what's left of his life. Be patient with him." They reached the edge of the garden, or what used to be one. The iron gate was half buried in vines, and the path beyond it was nearly lost under a tangle of weeds. Stone statues leaned at strange angles, their features softened by moss. In the center stood what might once have been a fountain, now cracked and silent, filled with rainwater and leaves. Nora took it in slowly, her artist's eye already tracing lines through the decay. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Helen looked at her, surprised. Most people wouldn't call it that. "It's sleeping," Nora said. "Not dead." For the first time. Helen's expression softened. "Then maybe you're the right one after all." She left Nora there with the keys and a quiet nod. The air smelled of earth and damp stone. Nora wandered among the overgrown paths, brushing her fingertips over the brittle stems of long-forgotten flowers. She imagined what the garden might have looked like years ago. Bursts of color, laughter drifting from the terrace. Evelyn Ashford with her camera, capturing the light before it faded. She crouched by a patch of soil where something green still fought its way up through the dirt. A tiny shoot, fragile but alive. She smiled without meaning to. "You're still here," she whispered. "Guess we both are." Behind her, a window creaked open. She turned and saw a figure standing on the balcony above Ethan. His silhouette was sharp against the fading sky. For a moment, she thought he might speak, but he only watched her. Nora lifted her hand in a small, uncertain wave. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, the curtain falling back into place. Something about that quiet exchange left a chill in her chest. Not fear, exactly. More like the ache of seeing someone who had built walls so high, even sunlight struggled to find a way in. As evening settled, Nora returned to her room. She lit the small lamp on her desk and opened her sketchbook. Her pencil moved almost on its own lines of the house, the garden, the man standing alone by the lake. She shaded the eyes carefully, leaving them pale and distant. When she finished, she stared at the page for a long time. She didn't know him, not really, but somehow the loneliness was unmistakable. It bled through every stroke. Downstairs, the clock chimed 7. The sound echoed through the halls like a slow heartbeat. Nora closed her sketchbook and looked toward the window. The lake was barely visible now, only the faint shimmer of moonlight on water. She whispered to herself, "No questions, just work." But as the house settled around her with a sigh of old wood and memory, she knew that was already a promise she might not be able to keep. And somewhere in the upper floor, behind a locked door, Ethan Ashford stood alone in the dark, listening. The next morning arrived with the kind of light that didn't quite belong to morning, yet soft, cold, uncertain. The fog still clung to the trees, and the air smelled faintly of wet leaves and metal. Nora stood at the edge of the garden, boots sinking into the damp ground, breath visible in the chill. The world around her felt still, as though even time had decided to pause before crossing that threshold. This was her canvas now, a forgotten piece of earth, fenced in by ivy and silence. She took a slow step forward. The soil crumbled dry beneath her shoes despite the mist. What should have been a place of color was now only brown and gray. Broken pots half buried in weeds, stone paths cracked by roots. It looked less like a garden and more like the memory of one. Nora crouched and brushed her fingers across the ground. The dirt was cold, powdery, lifeless to the touch, yet something inside her refused to call it dead. She had seen this before in her paintings, the way decay always hid a stubborn kind of beauty. You only had to stay long enough to see it breathe again. She worked slowly that first day, clearing one small corner at a time. The wind hummed low through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly sweet, like forgotten blossoms. Every time her shovel struck the earth, the sound echoed faintly across the hill, like a heartbeat returning. By noon, she was exhausted. She dropped onto a stone bench at the center of the garden and looked around. Her gloves were streaked with mud, and her hair clung damp to her forehead. But the stillness here no longer felt hostile. It felt waiting. She leaned forward, brushing away a cluster of dead leaves from the edge of a cracked stone path. And that's when she saw it, a single green shoot, no taller than her thumb, pushing through the soil. It was almost invisible, fragile and trembling, but alive. Against all logic, against years of neglect, something had survived. Nora stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, she smiled. "You stubborn little thing," she whispered. "You never gave up, did you?" Her breath fogged the air, and the tiny leaf quivered in response, as though answering. For a moment, she imagined Evelyn Ashford's hands once planting this garden, believing it would outlast her. Maybe it had. The sky began to darken with another wave of mist rolling in from the lake. Nora gathered her tools, wiping the dirt from her hands. As she turned toward the house, she caught sight of someone standing at the terrace above the same window as before. "Ethan?" He was watching her again, unmoving, one hand resting on the railing. The wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. For an instant, their eyes met. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't anger, not quite, more like surprise, or maybe recognition of something he hadn't expected to see again. Nora raised her hand slightly, a quiet hello through the distance. He hesitated, then turned away, disappearing back into the shadows of the house. She exhaled, a small laugh caught in her throat. "Well," she murmured to herself, "that's progress." He didn't glare. Inside, the house smelled faintly of smoke and cedar. Helen met her at the hallway, wiping her hands on an apron. "You've been out there all day," she said. "You should come eat before the soup gets cold." Nora smiled. "The garden's worse than I thought." Helen's eyes softened. It used to be her pride, you know, Mrs. Ashford's. She spent hours there, even on rainy days. Nora hesitated. "It must have been beautiful." "It was," Helen said quietly, "until it wasn't." She turned toward the kitchen before Nora could ask more. Later, as Nora sat at the small table with a bowl of soup cooling between her hands, she felt the weight of the house again. Every creak, every sigh of the wooden beams seemed to carry whispers of the life that once filled it. After dinner, she returned to her room, opened her sketchbook, and began to draw the little sprout she'd found. Her pencil moved gently, tracing its curve, its fragile defiance. Around it, she drew the empty space, the barren soil, the cracks, the quiet, but the green stood out against the gray, a single note of hope in an unfinished song. When she closed the book, she noticed the faintest sound outside. Footsteps, soft, measured. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain slightly aside. Down by the edge of the garden, a lantern flickered. Ethan was there, standing where she had worked that day. His head bent slightly as if studying the same spot she'd uncovered. The glow from the lantern brushed across his face, revealing something unexpected, not the cold detachment she'd seen before, but an ache, almost reverence. He crouched, touched the ground, then straightened slowly. His gaze lingered there for a moment longer before he turned and disappeared into the fog. Nora stepped back from the window, her heart oddly full. The image of him standing there stayed in her mind, the way even his silence seemed to speak. She sat on the edge of her bed, whispering into the stillness. "You've seen loss, haven't you? Just like this garden." The clock ticked softly from the hall. The house breathed around her, old and weary, but alive. Somewhere beyond the walls, the lake lapped gently against the shore. Nora looked at her dirt-stained hands, then at the faint smear of green beneath her fingernails. She smiled again, faint but real. Maybe life never truly vanished. Maybe it just waited for someone stubborn enough to kneel down and look for it. Outside, the fog shifted once more, revealing the faintest shimmer of moonlight on the garden's edge. And in the center of that broken soil, the tiny sprout trembled in the breeze, holding its ground beneath the weight of the night. Rain began again just after dusk, soft at first, like a whisper tracing the roof, then heavier, falling in waves that blurred the edge of the lake. Nora stood by the doorway of the garden shed, her coat damp, her hair clinging to her neck. The air smelled of wet cedar and iron. She had stayed outside longer than she meant to, finishing a sketch under the dim lantern light. Now, as the last page dried, she felt a strange pull toward the house. Ashford Hall loomed against the dark sky, its windows shuttered, its outline trembling in the rain. From this distance, it looked less like a home and more like a ship stranded on land, waiting for a tide that would never return. She closed her sketchbook, holding it against her chest as she stepped into the downpour. The path back to the house was slick with mud. Each step left a print that filled quickly with water, erasing itself before she could take the next. By the time she reached the terrace steps, she was soaked through. She paused there, catching her breath. The world was silent except for the rain and the soft murmur of thunder far away. She tilted her head, looking up toward the upper windows, most of them dark, lifeless. All except one. A single light glowed faintly from the second floor, casting a soft amber rectangle onto the rain. The curtain was drawn halfway, and behind it stood Ethan. He didn't move. He just watched her. For a moment, Nora froze, unsure what to do. The rain fell harder now, dripping from her lashes, sliding cold against her skin. She could barely make out his face, but she could feel the weight of his gaze steady, quiet. Not cold exactly, but distant in the way of someone who has lived too long behind glass. She didn't wave this time. She just stood there, looking up. The light flickered once, like a breath, then steadied again. Ethan's outline blurred behind the rain-slick glass, his figure softened by distance. And in that stillness, she realized something loneliness had shape. It wasn't just emptiness, it was a person standing at a window, looking out but never opening it. The thought came and went like a pulse. She turned, finally, heading toward the kitchen door. Inside, the warmth met her like an old friend she didn't expect to see. Helen looked up from drying dishes. "You're drenched," she said, her tone half scolding, half kind. "I lost track of time," Nora replied, slipping off her coat, the light in the garden so soft after rain. "I couldn't stop sketching." Helen handed her a towel. "Be careful. The weather here doesn't forgive carelessness." Nora smiled faintly. Neither do people. I guess. Helen's eyes flickered an unreadable look. Gone as quickly as it came. Some wounds make people quieter, she said softly. Not crueler. The housekeeper turned back to her dishes, leaving Nora alone with that thought. Later, in her room. Nora lit the small lamp and spread her sketches across the desk. The paper had curled at the edges, damp from the rain. Each drawing was a fragment of the garden, the broken fountain, the cracked stone steps, the little green sprout from the day before. She traced the line of the sprout with her fingertip, then paused. Outside, thunder rumbled low across the lake. The sound echoed through the hollow rooms. She glanced toward her window and saw that same light again, glowing from Ethan's study. Part of her wanted to close the curtain, but another part of her curious, tender, couldn't look away. What did he see from up there, night after night? The garden, the lake, or the ghost of someone he couldn't let go of? She thought of the way Helen spoke his name, soft but edged with pity, the way his eyes never seemed to focus on the present. She whispered, "You're not really here. Are you?" The lamp flickered once, as if answering. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat by the window, her breath fogging the glass. From this angle, she could see him move a faint shadow pacing the room. Then he stopped again, facing outward, still as a painting. The distance between them was only a few yards of stone and rain, but it felt like miles. She stayed there longer than she meant to, listening to the rhythm of the storm. It became almost comforting, the sound of rain against the roof, the steady hush of wind through the trees. Time blurred. When she finally looked up again, the light upstairs had dimmed. Ethan was still there, but now he wasn't looking at her. His head was bowed, his hand pressed against the window pane. Something about that gesture, the quiet surrender of it, caught in her throat. She didn't know what he was remembering, but she could feel it, the ache of it, like a chord struck too deep to fade. She whispered to the dark, "Who did you lose?" But the only answer was the rain. At some point, the light went out, the window went black. Nora stayed by her own window a little longer, her fingers tracing small circles on the glass. The fog pressed close, muting everything, making the house seem both infinite and small. She thought of the tiny sprout again, growing in silence under all this weight of memory. Maybe people weren't so different from gardens. Maybe they just needed light in the right place. When she finally turned away, she caught her reflection in the window, pale, blurred, eyes tired but awake. Behind her, the lamp still burned, a small, golden circle in a house full of ghosts. Outside, the rain began to slow. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, reflecting nothing but the moon's quiet approval. And though she didn't know why, Nora smiled. Because somewhere in that night between the thunder, the silence, and that single window light, something wordless had shifted. Something fragile had begun to reach back toward life. Morning drifted in, slow and silver, the kind of light that softened everything it touched. The garden still smelled of rain. Drops clung to every branch, trembling before they fell. Nora stepped into the cool air, a pair of pruning shears in her hand, her gloves already damp. The world felt fragile that morning, too quiet, too delicate to disturb, and yet, the work had to begin. She started at the far end of the path, near the old fountain where moss had claimed most of the stone. The weeds had grown wild again overnight, reaching for light they couldn't find. She crouched down, trimming gently, careful not to harm the few small shoots that had managed to survive. Her breath came slow, her movements unhurried, like she was listening for something beneath the soil. Every so often, she paused, wiping rain from her lashes, glancing toward the house. It stood still, its windows closed against the chill, no sign of him. Yet she could feel his presence, the same way you feel weather-changing quiet, unseen, but certain. The morning stretched on. The mist began to lift, revealing a patch of sky pale as milk. Nora climbed a few steps onto the low stone ledge by the garden wall to reach a climbing vine that had overgrown its trellis. The stones were slick beneath her boots, the air still heavy with damp. She reached higher, stretching, cutting through the stubborn tangle. The shears caught on a branch. She tugged once, twice, and the next moment, the footing gave way. The world tilted. Her hand slipped, the shears dropped, and a sharp sound of metal hitting stone echoed across the garden. She gasped, bracing for the fall, but it didn't come. A strong hand caught her arm firm, urgent, pulling her back before she hit the ground. She stumbled into him instead, breathless, for a heartbeat. All she felt was the warmth of him against the cold air, the rough wool of his coat, and the fast, uneven rhythm of his breathing. Ethan, he held her tightly, his grip steady but trembling, as though the act of holding had startled him as much as the fall. "Careful," he said, his voice low, barely audible. "These stones are older than they look." Nora blinked up at him, heart pounding. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." But she stopped, because she saw his hand, the one still holding her wrist. It was shaking, not from effort, but from something else, something deeper. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world narrowed to the sound of their breathing and the faint patter of water dripping from the leaves. His eyes met hers gray, unguarded, almost afraid. Then, just as quickly, he let go. "You shouldn't work on that wall alone," he said, stepping back. "It's unstable. I'll be more careful," she managed, still catching her breath. He bent down, picked up the fallen shears, brushed the dirt from them, and handed them to her without meeting her gaze. His fingers brushed hers barely, but it was enough to send a quiet ripple through her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once. "Helen said you've made progress in the East Garden." "A little," she said softly. "It's slow work, but there's something alive under all that ruin. You just have to look closely." He paused, the faintest trace of something crossing his face. Sadness? Maybe. "Some things shouldn't be uncovered," he said. "Maybe," she replied. "But some things are waiting to be." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, she thought she saw the echo of something he'd once been before the silence, before the weight of his own grief turned him to stone. A gust of wind passed through, scattering leaves between them. The moment broke. "I'll send someone to reinforce the wall," he said finally, his tone returning to its careful distance. "You can continue near the fountain tomorrow." Then he turned and started back toward the house. His stride was even, but his hand brushed briefly against the ivy as he walked, as though he needed to touch something real. Nora stood there, still feeling the imprint of his grasp on her arm, the tremor of it. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was the tremor of someone who had once reached for love and found only loss. She bent down, picking up a stray vine, twisting it gently between her fingers. Her heart was still racing. The silence that followed felt different now, warmer somehow, filled with something she couldn't yet name. When she looked up again, Ethan had vanished into the house, but one of the upper windows stood open, curtain moving slightly in the breeze, as if the air itself had begun to breathe again. She smiled faintly, not because she understood him, but because for the first time, she knew he wasn't unreachable. He was still human beneath all that distance, still capable of feeling, even if he'd forgotten how. That evening, as she washed the dirt from her hands, she noticed a faint bruise forming on her wrist where his fingers had held her. She traced it with her thumb, not with pain, but with a quiet kind of gratitude. It was proof of something, proof that he'd cared enough, even for a second, to catch her before she fell. She sat by her window as the light faded, sketchbook open again. This time, she didn't draw the garden. She drew two figures, one standing, one falling, and between them, the space where their hands met. Outside, the lake was still. The sky turned silver, then dark, and in the reflection of the window pane, she thought she saw his face again, distant, thoughtful, standing at the same place by the terrace where he'd caught her. The moment passed, quiet as breath. But the warmth of it stayed, steady and alive, long after the night took the rest of the light away. The morning after the fall was gray again, though the air carried a gentler chill, the kind that whispered rather than bit. Nora sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling between her palms. Helen moved quietly around the room, her steps soft and measured, the rhythm of a woman who had spent years walking through silence. The house creaked above them, old wood settling into its long memories. Neither spoke for a while. The clock ticked on the wall, steady and patient. Nora found herself watching the steam curl from her cup, the way it disappeared almost as soon as it formed. Finally, Helen broke the quiet. "You've been in the garden every day," she said. "Most people can't stand that place for long." Nora smiled faintly. "It doesn't scare me. It just feels lonely." Helen paused, drying her hands on a towel. "Lonely?" she repeated softly, as though tasting the word. "Yes, that's the right word for it." There was a silence after that, the kind that carried weight. Nora could feel the question forming in her throat before she could stop it. "Helen," she said carefully, "why did he lock it away? The garden, I mean." The older woman's hand stilled. For a moment, Nora thought she wouldn't answer. Then Helen turned, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't ask questions, mister. Ashford doesn't want answered." "I know," Nora said quietly, "but I can feel the sadness there. It's like it belongs to someone." Helen studied her for a long time, then sighed. "You're right, it does." She sat down across from Nora, folding her hands in her lap. Her name was Evelyn. The name seemed to move through the air like a breath, long held and finally released. His wife Nora asked softly. Helen nodded. She was a photographer, brilliant, free-spirited, kind. She saw the world differently, always through a lens, always in light. Ashford Hall was alive when she was here. There were people, laughter, music drifting down the halls. And then, Helen's gaze fell to the table. One night, 5 years ago, they argued. She left in the storm. He tried to stop her, but it was too late. The car went off the road near the cliffs. Nora's heart tightened. He was there. "No," Helen said. "That's the worst part. He wasn't. He found her the next morning. After that, he shut everything. The rooms she loved, the garden she tended, even her dark room. No one was allowed to speak her name again. The rain outside began to fall harder, tapping against the window panes like small reminders. Nora swallowed. So he's been living here, alone, since then. Alone, Helen said simply. And not living, not really. He eats when I remind him, works when he must, and every evening he stands by that same window upstairs, staring at the lake. She shook her head. Sometimes I think he's waiting for her to walk out of the fog. Nora looked down at her tea, now cold. The image of him standing motionless by the window felt suddenly heavier. It wasn't detachment she'd seen in his eyes those nights. It was grief, frozen so long it had forgotten how to melt. She whispered, "Does he ever talk about her?" "No," Helen said, "and neither should you. He built a life out of silence. Breaking it would only hurt him more. But Nora wasn't sure she believed that. Because silence didn't always protect it, sometimes suffocated. The day drifted on, soft and slow. Nora returned to the garden in the afternoon, though her thoughts stayed with what Helen had said. She walked along the broken path, seeing it differently now. Each empty bed, each overgrown vine felt like a memory trapped in soil. She knelt by the little green sprout she'd found days ago. It had grown taller since then, reaching bravely through the dirt. She brushed her fingers gently over its leaf. "You were hers, weren't you?" she murmured. "You belong to Evelyn." A breeze stirred, cool against her cheek. The branches rustled faintly above her, like the softest reply. For the rest of the afternoon, she worked quietly, clearing weeds, turning soil. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each stroke of her hand was an apology to someone she'd never met. From the house, a faint melody drifted through the open-air notes from a piano, hesitant and distant. Nora froze, listening. It came from upstairs, faint but real, a few chords, broken, unfinished. Then silence again. "Ethan?" She straightened, brushing dirt from her knees, her heart beating faster for reasons she couldn't name. There was something unbearably human about that sound, a man testing the edges of memory through music, a ghost reaching out through his own grief. The sky darkened early. By the time she returned inside, the hallways were dim, the lamps already lit. She found Helen in the library, closing the curtains for the night. "He was playing," Nora said softly. Helen's hands stilled. "He hasn't touched that piano in years." "I heard it," Nora said. "Just for a minute." Helen turned, her eyes full of something between disbelief and sorrow. "Then maybe he's starting to remember what life sounds like." The rest of the evening passed in quiet. Nora sat in her room with her sketchbook open, but her hands couldn't find the right lines. Instead, she wrote a name at the bottom of the page. Evelyn. Just that. The name looked fragile on the paper, as if even ink hesitated to disturb the air that carried it. Outside, rain still fell. The garden below shimmered under the soft glow of the terrace light, and somewhere upstairs, a single window flickered to life, the one that always did. She didn't look up this time. She didn't have to. She already knew he was there, standing in the dark, keeping watch over the echoes of the woman he'd loved and lost. Nora whispered into the quiet, "You're still listening for her, aren't you?" No one answered, but the rain against the glass shifted, softer, almost like a sigh, and for the first time, Nora realized Ashford Hall wasn't haunted by Evelyn's ghost. It was haunted by the love that refused to die with her. That night, when she finally drifted into sleep, she dreamed of the garden again. Only this time, it wasn't empty. A woman in white walked among the flowers, her camera hanging at her side, her smile gentle and knowing. She turned toward Nora, and in her eyes was something both sad and tender. A voice came through the dream warm, distant, but clear enough to wake her heart. "Don't let him stay in the dark." Nora woke with tears she couldn't explain, and a single thought she couldn't ignore. Maybe some silences weren't meant to be kept forever. The storm came without warning. One moment, the air outside was still. The next, the wind howled through the trees, rattling every window of Ashford Hall. Nora sat at her desk, sketching by lamplight, the rain hammering against the glass. The sound was relentless, like the sea itself had risen to pound on the old stone walls. She tried to focus on her drawing, but the storm carried its own kind of restlessness, a pulse that wouldn't let her settle. Somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed, then another. The sound echoed through the halls, sharp and hollow. Helen had long gone to bed. Nora hesitated, listening. Then came it a sharp, unmistakable crack. Glass breaking. Her breath caught. It was faint, but not far. Upstairs, maybe, the forbidden floor. She grabbed her lantern and stepped into the corridor. The house felt different tonight, alive in its unease. Every gust of wind pushed through the shutters like a breath through old lungs. The hallway stretched ahead, flickering with the soft light of her lantern. She moved carefully, her boots whispering against the wooden floor. Another sound, not the wind this time, a muffled voice. She followed it, past the library, past the old staircase, until she reached a corridor she had never dared to enter before. Dust lay thick on the floor, her footprints the only disturbance in years. At the end of the hall, a faint light spilled from beneath a half-closed door. Nora stopped. She knew what this was. The door Helen had once pointedly avoided when showing her around. The dark room, Evelyn's studio, the room that had stayed locked since the night she died. The sound came again, something shifting, a low curse, the clink of glass. Nora pushed the door open. The smell hit her first. Old chemicals, dust, and the sharp bite of spilled alcohol. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with memory. A single lamp hung crooked from the ceiling, its light dim but steady. The floor was littered with broken frames, shards of glass glinting in the glow. And there, sitting in the center of it all, was Ethan. He was slumped against a table, an open bottle beside him. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the look of a man unraveling quietly. His hair was damp, his eyes unfocused but burning with something raw. He didn't startle when he saw her. He only looked up slowly, his gaze meeting hers like he'd been expecting her all along. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. Her voice felt small in that room. He gave a humorless laugh. "Sleep." His words slurred slightly, but the pain beneath them was clear. "No one really sleeps in this house." Nora took a careful step closer. "You broke something." He glanced at the shattered frame near his feet. "I was trying to forget her face. Seems the glass didn't agree." Nora's lantern light caught the photograph on the floor, black and white, edges curling from age. It was a portrait, a woman in sunlight, smiling. Evelyn. Ethan followed her gaze, his expression tightening. "She used to stand right there," he said, pointing vaguely toward the window. "Said the light in this room was perfect, always chasing light, that woman." He swallowed hard, his voice cracking, "and I gave her nothing but shadows." Nora's chest ached. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. His grief filled the space, heavy and unfiltered, like air too thick to breathe. "She loved you?" Nora said quietly. His eyes snapped to hers. "And I killed her." The words landed like stones. He leaned forward, resting his head in his hands. "We fought that night. She wanted to leave to see the world, to have her own work, her own life. I told her she couldn't, that she belonged here, with me. I thought I was protecting her, but really..." He looked up again, eyes glassy, voice breaking. "I was protecting my pride." And then she drove off into that storm. The silence that followed felt endless. Only the rain spoke, drumming harder against the windows. Nora set the lantern down and crouched near him. "It was an accident," she said gently. "No," he whispered. "It was punishment." She shook her head. "You don't know that." He laughed again, soft, bitter. "I know enough. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the crash, the metal, the rain, and I see her hand reaching for me, and then nothing." Nora hesitated, her voice trembling now. "Maybe she forgave you." He looked at her, eyes dark and disbelieving. She held his gaze. "Maybe she forgave you before the rain even stopped. Maybe the only person who hasn't forgiven you is you." The words seemed to still the air. He stared at her for a long time, as if searching for something in her face. Then his shoulders sagged. "Forgiveness," he murmured, "that's for the living." Nora stood, her hand brushing lightly against his shoulder. "Then start living," she said softly. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he closed his eyes. His breathing steadied, the tremor in his hand easing slightly. When he spoke again, his voice was small, almost childlike. "I don't know how." Nora's heart broke a little at that. "Maybe you don't have to know. Maybe you just start by opening a window." The lantern flickered between them, shadows trembling along the walls. Ethan looked toward the photograph on the floor. The image of Evelyn stared back serene, timeless. He bent, picked it up, and brushed the dust from its surface. For a second, his thumb lingered on her face. Then he set it gently on the table. Nora stepped back, giving him space. Neither spoke. The storm began to quiet outside, the rain slowing to a steady whisper, the kind that sounded like breathing. When Nora finally turned to leave, Ethan said her name, just once. Softly, she looked back. He was still seated, his expression unreadable but calmer somehow. The bottle was pushed aside, his hands were still. "Thank you," he said, for what she asked, for not being afraid to walk into the dark. She nodded once. "The dark isn't the enemy," she said. "It's what helps you see where the light is missing." He didn't answer, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared down the hall. Outside, the first break in the storm revealed a sliver of moonlight through the clouds. It fell across the window of the dark room, Glinting off the photograph of Evelyn, her face, caught in that soft silver glow, looked almost alive again. And for the first time in years, the house seemed to exhale. The morning after the storm felt hollow, as if the house itself had exhausted its breath. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried that metallic scent, wet stone, old iron, and something faintly sad. Nora came down the grand staircase to find the study door open. Ethan was already there, standing by the wide desk, papers spread before him like evidence in a quiet trial. His shirt was crisp again, his posture composed, but his face was a mask, calm, clean, and closed. He didn't look up right away. The only sound was the scratch of his pen against paper. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, but with a restraint that made the room feel colder. She sat, her hands folded in her lap, the silence stretched between them. He placed the paper in front of her, turning it so she could read. The ink was still fresh, dark against the white. "An amendment," he said, "to our original agreement." She read it once, slowly. The words were simple, a few lines only. Clause 6. The restoration consultant will refrain from discussing any matters relating to the former Mrs. Evelyn Ashford. No mention of her name, her work, or her private quarters will be made for the duration of the project. Nora looked up. "You want to put silence in writing?" Ethan's gaze flickered. "I want to protect what little peace this house has left." She studied him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cruel. He was simply retreating, folding back into the walls like he'd done for years. "And if I refuse," she asked quietly, "then you'll still be paid for your time," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "and someone else will finish what you started." For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked, marking seconds that felt heavier than they should. Finally, Nora took the pen. Her hand hovered above the line where she was meant to sign. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Pretending silence can protect you. It never does." His eyes lifted then, sharp, searching hers. "You think you understand grief?" "I don't," she admitted. "But I understand what happens when you build a life around avoiding it." Something flickered in his jaw, a muscle tightening. He didn't answer. She signed. The sound of the pen scratching across the page was the only thing that moved between them. When she set it down, she looked at him again and said softly, "You can make everyone here stop talking, but the garden won't. It remembers her, and it's already starting to speak again." He didn't reply, only looked at her for a moment too long, as though her words had touched something he'd sworn to keep buried. Then, quietly, he folded the contract and slipped it into a leather folder. "You may resume work tomorrow," he said. When she left the study, the corridor felt different, colder somehow, but not cruelly so, just distant, like a winter morning that refused to let the sun through. Outside, the garden shimmered with the remnants of the storm. Drops clung to the rose stems like crystal beads. The air was full of the sound of water finding its way back to the earth. Nora stood at the edge of the path, breathing it in. She knelt, pressing her hand to the damp soil. It was softer now, pliant, open, beneath her fingers. The roots felt alive again. She smiled faintly, whispering as if to the plants themselves, "He can't keep you quiet either." The wind stirred gently in response, brushing a strand of hair across her face. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she imagined Evelyn walking beside her, the rustle of her dress in the tall grass, her laughter caught in the leaves. That night, Nora dreamed again of photographs strung along a line, drying in the sunlight. Each one showed the same garden, only in different seasons. And in every picture, there was always one corner left untouched by decay, always one spot where something green refused to die. When she woke, the first light of morning slipped through the curtains. She could hear faint movement from the hallway, Ethan's footsteps, measured, deliberate. He was up early, as always. But this time, there was something else. A pause, a hesitation outside her door. He didn't knock, just stood there for a moment, then moved on. Nora rose, walked to the window. From there, she could see him standing by the edge of the garden, coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked small from this distance, not the imposing figure she'd first met, but a man trying, perhaps, to stand beside something he'd long avoided. He stayed there a long time. Later, when Nora stepped outside to begin her work, she found something resting on the stone ledge near the fountain, a single sheet of old photo paper, untouched by rain. She picked it up carefully. On it was the faint, ghostly outline of leaves, their shapes pressed into the page like shadows caught in time. No words, no explanation, just that silent image. She looked up toward the house. His window was open, curtains shifting in the breeze. For the first time, she didn't feel watched. She felt seen. As the day wore on, she worked quietly, her hands moving through the soil, her heart steady. The house behind her stood still, wrapped in its silence. But the garden had begun to hum again, softly, beneath her fingertips. And somewhere inside that old mansion, a man who thought he had buried love forever was beginning, ever so faintly, to hear it breathe. The storm came back that night, fierce and uninvited. Wind scraped the windows like restless hands, and the lights flickered twice before giving up entirely. The whole house sank into darkness, the kind that swallowed sound. For a moment, Nora just sat there, still as the rain pressed harder against the glass. Her heartbeat the only thing she could hear. Then she reached for the small box of candles Helen had left on the mantel. One by one, she lit them. The soft glow spread slowly across the room, touching the corners, making the shadows breathe again. The light wasn't bright, but it was warm, like a heartbeat in a cold chest. She poured herself a cup of tea, though it was already lukewarm, and sat near the window. The garden below shimmered faintly under the storm. Even in the dark, she could sense it alive, listening. She set her cup down and began humming, without realizing it, a tune she used to hum as a child when she painted, small and uncertain, the kind of song that comes from the space between thoughts. Her voice was soft at first, barely there, just a thread of sound weaving through the air, but it filled the silence, gentle as rain falling on leaves. She closed her eyes and let it wander. Words formed, half remembered, half made up something about light finding its way home. She didn't mean for anyone to hear. It was just a sound for herself, for the quiet house, for the ghosts that lingered. Then, a floorboard creaked. She turned slightly, the candlelight flickering across her face. Ethan stood in the doorway. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his hair damp from the storm, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, just stood there in the glow of the candles, watching her as if he wasn't sure if she was real. Nora's breath caught. "Sorry," she murmured. "Did I wake you?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I heard music." His voice was rough, low. It's been a long time since this house had any. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The rain softened, tapping lightly now, as though eavesdropping. Ethan stepped closer, slow, deliberate. The candlelight brushed against him, softening the hard lines of his face. He looked around the room, then at her again. "Keep singing," he said quietly. She hesitated. "It's just something small. Please." It was the first time he'd said that word to her. So she sang again, this time louder. The notes wavered a little, uncertain, but they carried. She didn't think about the melody. She just let it fall where it wanted. Her voice filled the space like water finding cracks in stone. Ethan moved to the piano in the corner, a grand thing covered in dust and years of silence. He brushed a hand across the keys, hesitating. Then he pressed one. A soft, fragile note rang out, slightly out of tune, but achingly alive. He looked at her. She nodded, and just like that, the house began to breathe again. He played quietly, slowly, following her voice instead of leading it. The melody stumbled at first, like two strangers learning to walk side by side. But it found its rhythm. The piano and her voice moved together, not perfectly, not smoothly, but truthfully. Ethan's eyes stayed on the keys, but there was something different in his face now. The walls around him seemed thinner, his shoulders less rigid. The candlelight caught the glint of his wedding band. He hadn't taken it off, and for a brief, almost invisible moment, his hand trembled over the notes. Nora's song softened, almost a whisper. She looked at him. "You used to play," she said gently. He nodded once. She used to sing. The words hung there, fragile as glass. Nora didn't speak. She didn't need to. The music carried the rest. Between them, silence turned from something heavy into something sacred. When the last note faded, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The candles burned low, their flames trembling as if listening too. Ethan leaned back, his eyes distant, voice quiet. "I thought I'd forgotten how," he said. "You didn't forget," Nora said softly. "You just stopped letting yourself remember." He gave a faint smile, tired but real. Maybe. For a moment, they sat like that, two silhouettes in a sea of candlelight. The storm outside finally drifted away, leaving behind only the faint sound of dripping water and the heartbeat of the house settling back into peace. Ethan broke the silence again. "When you sang," he said slowly, "it reminded me of something I used to believe, that music could reach her. Wherever she is." Nora turned toward him. "Maybe it still can." He looked at her, then not as an intruder, not as the woman disturbing his solitude, but as someone who had unknowingly opened a door he thought was sealed forever. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly, though there was no anger in it. "I didn't," she answered. "I was called," he frowned slightly, "by who?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe by the house, maybe by her." He didn't respond, but for the first time since she'd arrived, Ethan laughed, not loud, not long, but enough to make the room warmer. The sound startled her, and then it made her laugh too, just a small, quiet one. It was strange how fragile the moment was, like glass catching candlelight. It could break so easily, and yet it didn't. It stayed. After a while, Ethan stood, blowing out one of the candles. "We'll lose the rest of the light soon," he said. "You should sleep. And you." He looked toward the piano. "I'll stay a little longer." Nora nodded. She gathered her things, pausing at the door. The last candlelight painted gold across his face as he sat again, fingers touching the keys. She turned once more before leaving. "Good night, Ethan." He didn't look up, but his reply came low and sure. "Good night, Nora." Outside her room, the hallway was quiet. The faint hum of the piano followed her up the stairs. It wasn't a song she recognized, but it was beautiful in its brokenness. When she reached her window, the sky had cleared. The moonlight spilled across the garden, silvering the new buds that had begun to open after the storm. Nora stood there, listening to the distant melody drifting from below. And in that fragile, perfect silence, she realized music wasn't just sound. It was memory learning to forgive itself. Downstairs, Ethan kept playing until the candles went out. The wind had begun to rise again, though the sky was clear. Sometimes, storms didn't come from clouds. They came from the weight of what couldn't be said. That night, Nora sat by her window, her lamp dimmed to a soft amber glow. She had been sketching, though her hand had stopped long ago. The pencil still rested between her fingers, the page before her half empty. It had been days since the night of music, and yet something in the air between them had changed unspoken, fragile, like glass balancing on the edge of a shelf. The knock came suddenly, 3 short, uneven taps, not firm, not polite, desperate. She turned, heart quickening. The clock on the dresser read a little past midnight. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there. His shirt was wrinkled, collar open, his hair damp, not from rain this time, but from the night itself. His eyes were darker, glassy with drink, though his voice, when he spoke, was steady in a broken way. "I shouldn't be here," he said. She nodded slowly. Probably not. But she didn't close the door. He stepped inside, his steps unsteady but full of intent. The air shifted around him, heavy with the scent of whiskey and something else, loneliness. Old and familiar. He didn't sit. He only stood near her desk, eyes falling on her sketchbook. "You draw the same things she used to," he murmured. "The way the light bends in corners, the way stillness looks alive." Nora's breath caught. "Ethan, I hear her." He went on, voice rough. "When you hum, when you move through the house, when you look at the garden." He turned toward her, eyes sharp with the ache of confession. "You make me feel like she's still here." The words landed between them like a spark. Nora stared at him, her pulse quickening. "I'm not her," she said softly. "I know," he said, almost fiercely. "But when I look at you, I forget how to grieve." The silence that followed was thick, trembling. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows, whispering like breath through an open door. Nora took a step toward him. "Ethan, you can't live through me. You can't keep dying through her." He shook his head, as if her words only deepened the confusion. "You don't understand. I understand more than you think," she said quietly. "You built this place like a tomb, and you've been buried with her ever since." He turned away, running a hand through his hair. "And what do you want me to do? Forget her? Pretend she never existed?" "No," Nora said. Her voice was calm, steady, even when her heart wasn't. "I want you to remember her without disappearing." He laughed once, harsh and low. "You make it sound simple." "It's not," she replied, "but neither is breathing, and you still do that." He stared at her for a long moment, something flickering in his eyes, anger, sorrow, gratitude, all tangled together. Then he moved closer, too close. The space between them felt electric, alive, dangerous. "Every time I see you," he said, his voice almost breaking, "I remember what warmth feels like, and that terrifies me." Nora swallowed hard. "Then be terrified, but don't run." His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed against her arm. The touch was tentative, trembling, the kind of touch that came from someone who hadn't reached for another person in years. "I shouldn't," he whispered. "Maybe not," she said, "but you are." For a heartbeat. They stood still, two souls caught in the quiet aftermath of everything they'd both lost. Then, as if drawn by something older than sense, he leaned in. The kiss wasn't perfect. It wasn't gentle. It was raw, broken, human. The taste of rain and whiskey, of grief trying to remember how to feel like love again. His hand moved to her cheek, her breath catching in his palm. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. Because in that single moment, the distance between life and loss dissolved. When they finally parted, the room felt smaller, quieter. The candle flickered beside them, flame trembling as though it had seen too much. Nora's voice was barely a whisper. "You can't bring her back this way." He closed his eyes, his forehead resting against hers. "I know." "Then why?" "Because I needed to remember I was still alive," he said. She breathed in deeply, her chest aching. "And now that you do..." He stepped back slightly, his eyes full of something that looked like shame, but also release. "Now I feel everything I've been trying not to. That's what living is," she said. "It's not forgetting the pain, it's carrying it differently." He didn't answer. He only looked at her like a man seeing daylight after too long underground. The wind outside began to calm. The house, once restless, seemed to settle again. Ethan reached for the sketchbook on her desk, tracing one of the unfinished lines with his finger. "You draw the garden as if it's waiting for something," he said. "It is," she replied. He looked up, his gaze searching hers. For what? For someone to stop being afraid of it? He smiled faintly, tired, tender. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. Nora stood there for a long time, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. Her lips still carried the warmth of his, but her heart was trembling for reasons she couldn't name. She walked to the window. The moon hung low above the lake, pale and still. In its reflection, she saw two shadows passing their own, crossing paths in the silver light. She pressed her fingertips to the glass. "You can't save him by loving his ghosts," she whispered to herself. Down the hall, a door closed softly, and in the quiet that followed, Nora felt the truth settle deep within her chest. Healing was never neat, and love, real love, was never free of pain. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth walking through the storm for. The next morning arrived quiet but heavy, the kind of silence that follows a storm but never truly leaves. The sky was pale, and the lake outside the window looked like a mirror someone had forgotten to wipe clean. Nora sat in the garden, sketchbook resting on her knees. Though she hadn't drawn a single line, her mind was still caught in the echo of last night, the trembling in Ethan's voice, the pain behind his eyes, the kiss that had felt more like a confession than desire. She hadn't seen him since. Helen had noticed the tension, but said nothing. She moved around the kitchen as always, humming faintly, pretending the air wasn't charged with things left unsaid. Nora stayed outside longer than usual, waiting for something, though she wasn't sure what. It was close to noon when she saw him. Ethan stood by the edge of the path, his coat unbuttoned, his face drawn but clear. There was something different in the way he carried himself, lighter and heavier at once, like a man who'd finally decided to open a wound. "Nora," he said quietly, "walk with me." She followed him without question. They didn't speak as they crossed the garden, the gravel crunching softly underfoot. The wind moved gently through the branches, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. He led her to the small stone bench near the fountain, the one she'd cleaned weeks ago. They sat, not facing each other, but the lake. For a while, he said nothing. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlocked, knuckles pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, stripped bare. The night Evelyn died, it rained like this. Nora looked at him, but he didn't return the gaze. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, distant. She wanted to leave. He continued, "Not me, the house, the life." She said she needed to find herself again, to work on her own, to travel, to see light that didn't belong to me. He laughed once, without humor, and I couldn't stand it. The idea that she wanted something I couldn't give. He exhaled slowly, a sound that seemed to come from deep inside. We fought. It started small, like all fights do, but then words started to cut deeper. I told her she was ungrateful. That everything she had, this house, her studio, her comfort, came from me. She said that was the problem. The wind shifted, cold against their faces. She packed a bag. I thought she was bluffing. His voice broke slightly. She said, "If you can't see me without owning me, I have to go." And he swallowed hard. I told her, "Then go. If you want to leave, go." The quiet that followed was so deep, Nora could hear the faint rhythm of the water dripping from the fountain. "She did," he whispered. She walked out. I didn't follow. I wanted to. I told myself I would in a minute. After I cooled off, after she realized I was right, his hands tightened together. But by the time I stepped outside, the rain had already swallowed the road. The car was gone. He turned to her then, and the grief in his eyes was raw, honest, merciless. They found her the next morning, 10 miles from here. The brakes failed on the cliff road. They said she probably never saw it coming. He paused. I saw it every night for 5 years. Nora couldn't speak. She felt her own chest tighten, her throat burn. I thought the house would fall apart without her. He said, but it didn't. It stayed the same. The same walls, the same rooms, the same ghosts. Only I changed. I became less. I filled every corner with silence so I wouldn't have to hear her voice echoing back. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. You asked me once why I locked the garden. It wasn't because I hated it. It was because I couldn't stand how alive it was, how it kept growing while she didn't. Nora felt tears press behind her eyes. You've been living with her death like it's a punishment, she said softly. But it's not. He shook his head. It feels like it is. She turned toward him fully, her voice steady but trembling with feeling. Ethan, the rain took her. But you've let that same rain drown you, over and over, every day since. You're still standing in that storm. He closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. And how do I stop it by walking out of it, she said, by letting it be just what it was, a moment, not a life sentence. He looked at her then, really looked. The sunlight broke briefly through the clouds, catching the reflection of the lake in his eyes. For the first time, they didn't look like winter, they looked like thaw. I don't know if I can, he whispered. She reached out, her hand resting over his. You don't have to know. You just have to want to. He stared down at their joined hands. His skin was cool, hers warm. The contrast said everything neither of them could. The silence between them softened. For the first time since that night 5 years ago, Ethan didn't feel suffocated by it. It felt like breathing. They stayed like that until the light shifted, until the air smelled less of regret and more of earth. When he finally spoke again, it was quieter, almost to himself. She deserved better than the man I was. She got the man who loved her, Nora said, even if he didn't know how to show it right. He didn't answer, but the faintest trace of peace crossed his features. When Nora stood to leave, Ethan remained seated, his gaze fixed on the garden. She turned once more before walking away. He was still there, motionless but not hollow anymore. As she reached the steps, he called after her, Nora. She stopped. He hesitated, then said softly, Thank you for listening to a ghost. She smiled sadly. You're not a ghost. Ethan, not anymore. He nodded once, the wind brushing through his hair. Maybe, he said, but I'm still learning how to be alive. When she walked back toward the house, the clouds had started to thin. A single ray of sunlight slipped through, landing on the garden path. She stopped, looking up at the sky. The storm had ended not just outside, but somewhere deep inside him. And for the first time since she'd come to Ashford Hall, Nora felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that grows when someone finally decides to remember differently. The morning was gentle, washed in the pale gold of early sunlight, the kind of light that comes after weeks of rain clean, forgiving, quiet. Nora stood by the window of her studio in Ashford Hall, her hands smudged with the faint green and amber traces of paint. The final strokes on the canvas still glistened wet under the light. It was finished, the painting she'd spent the last months breathing into existence. The garden that waited. It was everything the house had held, and everything it had healed: the withered trees, the reborn flowers, the single path that led to the lake, where reflection met sky. And in the center, barely visible unless one looked close enough, the outline of two figures, one standing, one sitting, both blurred by distance, by time, by forgiveness. Nora stepped back, heart full but strangely still. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was release. Ethan came to the doorway without a sound. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, eyes drawn to the painting, as if afraid to disturb the moment. The morning light fell across his face, softening it. It's beautiful, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. It's yours now. Or maybe it always was. He shook his head. No, Nora. It's yours. You gave this house back its breath. Their eyes met. And for the first time since she had arrived, there was no grief in his gaze, only a quiet kind of gratitude. That afternoon, Nora packed the painting carefully, wrapping it in linen and paper. The local gallery had requested it for an exhibit restoration and memory. She would only be gone for 2 days. Ethan offered to drive her, but she insisted. "You've spent too long inside storms," she said with a smile. "This one, I can walk through alone." He smiled back, though something uneasy flickered behind it. "Just drive carefully," he murmured. "I always do." He helped her load the car, the painting laid flat in the back, her small suitcase beside it. When she turned to close the trunk, Ethan reached out impulsively, brushing his thumb along the back of her hand. It was a simple touch, almost accidental, but the weight of it lingered. "If the world asks," he said softly, "tell them I'm still learning how to live." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then I'll tell them you've begun." The engine started with a low hum. The gravel crunched beneath her tires as she pulled away, the road curling through the mist like a ribbon. Ethan stood there until her car disappeared between the trees. The house was too quiet without her. Helen moved about softly, the way one does when trying not to wake a memory. Ethan walked into the garden, the one that no longer felt dead. The flowers were in full bloom now, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and lavender. He sat by the fountain, listening to the trickle of water and thinking about how easily silence could turn from a prison into peace. Hours passed. The sun climbed, then drifted toward the line of the hills. He made tea, half expecting to hear her footsteps, half pretending he didn't. By late afternoon, the first drops of rain began to fall thin, silver threads against the windows. A passing storm, nothing more. He poured a second cup, out of habit. Then, the phone rang. The sound startled him sharp, insistent, cutting through the soft rain like a knife. He hesitated, a hollow unease rising in his chest. When he picked up, Helen's voice was trembling on the other end. "It's the sheriff's office," she said. They need to speak with you." The next few seconds felt like eternity, stretching too thin. "Mr. Ashford." The voice on the line was male, steady but heavy. "There's been an accident on the coastal road, near Blue Hollow. A car skidded off during the rain. We found a painting in the back seat signed Nora Bennett." Ethan's throat closed. His hand tightened around the receiver. "No," he whispered. "They're transporting her to St. Luke's Hospital," the man continued. "She's—" But Ethan didn't hear the rest. The line slipped from his hand, swinging lightly against the wall. He was already moving. Rain hammered against the windshield as he drove, the wipers struggling to keep up. The world outside blurred into gray and motion. Every bend in the road felt like a memory too familiar, too cruel. It was the same route Evelyn had taken 5 years ago. The same storm, the same endless stretch of wet road that swallowed headlights whole. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel. "No," he said under his breath, again and again, like a prayer, like a command to the universe. Not again, not her. The wind howled across the cliffs. Trees bent under the force of the rain. He could barely see, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. Every mile was a battle between the past and the present, between what he'd lost and what he couldn't bear to lose again. By the time he reached the flashing lights, the road was slick with mud and panic. 2 officers waved him down, but he barely saw them. Her car was off the road, near the embankment, its front end crumpled, windshield cracked. Rain poured through the open driver's door. He stumbled out, the cold slamming into him like a wall. "Sir, please," one of the paramedics began, but Ethan pushed past him, slipping on the wet gravel. "Nora." His voice broke in the storm. "Nora." A stretcher was being lifted toward the ambulance. For a second, he saw her pale, motionless, her hair damp and tangled, her hand dangling limp at her side. He reached out, his voice trembling. "No, no, please." "Sir," the medic said, firm but gentle. "She's alive. Head injury, some broken ribs, but she's alive." Ethan froze. His breath caught like a thread pulled too tight. The world seemed to tilt, then right itself again. Alive. He stepped closer, trembling as he looked down at her. Her face was peaceful, almost serene despite the bruises, her lips slightly parted as if caught mid-dream. One of the paramedics lifted the canvas from the wreck still intact, wrapped in linen. The title was smeared, but legible. The garden that waited. Ethan stared at it through the rain. The irony was unbearable and perfect all at once. He whispered, almost to himself, "The garden waited, and so did I." As the ambulance doors closed, he pressed his hand against the cold metal. His reflection blurred in the rain, not the man haunted by loss anymore, but one learning how to fight for what was still left. The road ahead shimmered under the storm, endless and uncertain. But this time, he followed. Hospitals had their own kind of silence, not empty, but watchful, the kind that held its breath between heartbeats. For 3 days, Ethan lived inside that silence. He sat by her bedside, his body still, his mind anything but. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound that kept him tethered. Every rise and fall on that green line was a promise fragile, uncertain, but alive. Nora lay motionless beneath the white sheets, her face pale, her lips colorless. A small bruise traced her temple, a faint shadow of what had happened. He remembered the sirens, the blood on his hands when he reached for her, the way her name had torn out of him raw, desperate. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. Helen had brought food, begged him to rest, but he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Evelyn's car on that same road, the same rain, the same helplessness. Only this time, he'd made it to the scene in time to see her still breathing, and that made it both better and worse. He whispered sometimes, not prayers, not really. He didn't know how to pray, but he spoke to something, to life, to the air, to the God he'd stopped believing in. "Don't take her," he'd murmur, "not her, not now." On the second night, he touched her hand. It was warm, faintly, like a candle that refused to go out. "You have to wake up," he said, voice cracking. "You said I had to live again, but you can't tell me that and leave me here." The nurse checked on them quietly, adjusted the IV, left them alone again. The world outside the window blurred into rain. He thought about the garden, about the seed she'd planted that somehow bloomed through frost. He'd laughed when he saw it once, calling it stubborn. Now he understood. She'd always been that life insisting on living, no matter how cold the soil. By dawn of the third day, the light had changed. It poured through the blinds in soft ribbons, gentle and golden. Ethan's head rested near her arm, his eyes red, his breath uneven. Then, the smallest movement. Her fingers just barely twitched against his. It was so faint, he almost thought he imagined it. But then it came again, like the first ripple on still water. He lifted his head, heart pounding. Nora. Nothing at first, only the rhythm of the monitor, steady as before. Then her eyelids fluttered, slowly, weakly. She opened her eyes. Ethan froze. For a heartbeat. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His breath caught, his throat tight. Her gaze was unfocused at first, then slowly found him. "Hey," she whispered. Her voice was rough, fragile, but alive. He laughed, a choked, broken sound that turned into a sob. His hands trembled as he brushed her hair from her forehead. "You're here," he said. "You're really here." She gave the smallest smile. "Seems so." Tears blurred his vision. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead gently against her hand. For a moment. Everything else, the machines, the nurses, the sterile smell of antiseptic disappeared. There was only her hand, her breath, her voice. She looked at him. Really looked, even through the haze of painkillers and exhaustion. She could see what the last days had done to him. His beard unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped from too much waiting. "You didn't leave," she said softly. "I couldn't. You haven't slept." "I couldn't do that either." Her thumb brushed weakly against his palm. "Ethan," she whispered, "you don't have to keep paying for things you can't undo." He closed his eyes, tears slipping down. "I thought I already learned that. But when I saw your car..." He stopped, breath catching. "I thought it was happening again. I thought," she interrupted gently. "It didn't. You made it here. That's the difference." The way she said it, simple, steady, grounded him. Ethan, she murmured again, you don't need to atone, you just need to live. Something inside him cracked, not the painful kind, the kind that lets the light in. He bent his head, his lips brushing her knuckles. I don't know how to pray, he said quietly, but if I did, it would sound like this. You waking up. Her smile deepened, faint but real. Then maybe that's enough. The nurse came in quietly, checking her vitals, smiling at Ethan like people do when they see something fragile begin to heal. He nodded without speaking, his hand still wrapped around Nora's. When the nurse left, the room fell into soft silence again. Outside, the sky had turned a clear blue, the kind of color that only appears after a storm. Ethan turned toward the window, the light falling across his face. He exhaled long, unsteady, but lighter than it had been in years. You should sleep, Nora said. He shook his head. Not yet. She tilted her head slightly. You'll make yourself sick. I don't care. She smiled. You're stubborn. He gave a quiet laugh. So, I've been told. For a long while, they didn't speak, just sat in the quiet, her breathing even, his heart finally slowing. The world outside continued without them, cars, people, time, but inside that room. Everything had paused, as if giving them permission to simply exist. When Nora finally drifted back to sleep, Ethan stayed where he was, his thumb tracing small circles against her wrist. For the first time in years, he didn't think of Evelyn's last night. He didn't think of the rain or the broken glass. He thought of the garden, of the seed that refused to die. He thought of this, of her hand in his, and realized what faith really meant, not in gods or ghosts, but in the fragile, miraculous act of staying. He looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. You came back, and for once, he didn't mean from death. He meant from fear, from silence, from everything he thought was gone forever. He leaned back, his hand still holding hers, and let himself close his eyes not in exhaustion, but in peace. Outside the window, morning light spread across the hospital lawn. Somewhere, far away, a bell chimed softly, and inside that small, quiet room, Ethan Ashford, the man who had forgotten how to pray, finally learned. The air in Portland carried that crisp sweetness of early spring, the kind that feels like forgiveness. After months of gray, the city had begun to bloom again, every corner touched by color and rain-washed light. Inside the gallery, people moved softly between the walls lined with Nora's paintings, their voices low, reverent, like they knew they were standing inside something tender. The exhibit was called The Garden That Waited. Each piece told a quiet story, not of sorrow, but of patience. There were no grand scenes, no perfect flowers, just soil, roots, the slow return of green, a celebration of what endures when no one is watching. Nora stood near the last painting, Ashford in Spring. It showed the mansion from afar, the windows glowing faintly under a setting sun, the old gate half open. She'd painted it from memory, but also from hope. She was speaking to a curator when she felt at that small shift in the room, the way air changes when someone familiar enters. She turned. Ethan stood near the doorway, dressed in a simple gray suit, his hair still bearing a touch of rain. He looked uncertain, almost shy, the way a man might when walking into a memory that has forgiven him. Their eyes met, and everything else fell away, the people, the lights, the sound. He walked toward her slowly. She met him halfway. You came, she said softly. I wouldn't miss it, he replied. His voice carried that same roughness she had first heard months ago, but it was different now, warmer, steady, alive. They stood before her painting, side by side, silent for a moment. It looks different, he murmured. The house. Nora smiled. Because it is. He nodded, as if he understood that she wasn't just talking about the building. Then, from his pocket, he drew out a small velvet box. Her breath caught. I've spent too long building walls, he said. I think I'd rather build something else now. He opened the box. Inside, a ring silver, simple, set with a pale mint green stone, the color of new leaves, he added, of second chances. The crowd nearby fell quiet as if the room itself was listening. Nora looked up at him, her eyes bright, her smile trembling. Yes, she whispered. When he slid the ring onto her finger, applause rose softly around them, gentle, respectful, like rain on glass. Ethan's hand lingered in hers. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. After the exhibit, they drove back to Maine, the long road unwinding between mist and sea. The sky that evening was painted in shades of lavender and rose, the kind of sky that promised peace without words. Ashford Hall waited on the hill, still and luminous under the soft light, but it no longer looked lonely. The windows glowed with warmth, the garden alive, again lavender swaying in the breeze, vines climbing over stone. The sound of the fountain had returned, steady and calm. Nora carried a small can of white paint. Ethan brought brushes. Together. They stood before the iron gate once rusted, now waiting like an unopened letter. She dipped the brush first, dragging the color gently across the metal. He joined her, their strokes slow, quiet, rhythmic. It wasn't about restoring what was lost. It was about honoring what remained. When the gate was fully white, she stepped back, wiping a strand of hair from her cheek. "Looks different already," she said. Ethan looked at her, smiling, "Because it is." They left the brushes resting on the fence, paint still dripping softly onto the earth. The scent of lavender drifted around them, carried by a mild wind that came off the lake. They sat on the steps, side by side, the sun lowering behind the trees. The air shimmered gold against the water. For a long while, neither spoke. They didn't need to fill the silence anymore. It had become a friend. Nora leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. "You ever think she'd be happy to see this?" Ethan's eyes softened. "I think she'd tell us the garden finally found its season." Nora smiled, closing her eyes. The first stars began to appear faint, delicate, trembling like distant candles. Inside the house, the lights glowed steady and warm, spilling across the floorboards like morning come early. There were no ghosts now, no echoes of grief, no unspoken apologies, only breath, only life. Ethan reached over, his fingers finding hers. "You know," he said quietly, "for years, I thought silence was the safest way to love someone." She looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. And now, he smiled, small and honest. "Now I know love sounds like this." She tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like two people painting the same gate," he said, and not needing to say a word. She laughed softly, a sound like wind through new leaves, and for a long moment, time seemed to pause. The house, the garden, the fading sun, all of it held in a single breath of stillness. When she finally spoke again, it was so soft that only the evening heard her. "We're home. Ethan?" He looked at her. Then at the horizon, where the sky met the lake. The water shimmered mint green, the same color as the stone on her hand. "Yes," he said. "We are." The day faded into dusk, and dusk into the calm hum of night. The gate, freshly painted, gleamed pale under the stars. And somewhere deep in the soil, unseen but certain, new roots began to take hold, not the kind that bound, the kind that grew toward the light. Sometimes, life doesn't ask us to start over. It asks us to begin again, softly, from where we are. Ethan and Nora's story reminds us that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about learning to live beside it with grace. We all carry our own storms, moments of regret, loss, or silence that stay too long. Yet, even after years of emptiness, something small and alive still waits inside us, like that tiny seed in Nora's garden, ready to grow again if only someone dares to care. Love, in the end, isn't about perfection or promises. It's about present staying, listening, forgiving. It's about choosing to see beauty in the cracks instead of pretending they don't exist. As we grow older, we learn that time doesn't heal by itself. People do, through kindness, patience, and the courage to reach out again. Like the garden that waited, our hearts can bloom again not as they once were, but in a way that's quieter, wiser, and full of light, because love never really leaves us. It just waits for us to be ready to return. Thank you, dear listeners, for staying with us through this story, for every quiet moment you shared, every breath you took along with Nora and Ethan. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you gentle, meaningful stories, the kind that remind us of kindness, hope, and the beauty of second chances. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep believing in the quiet miracles of everyday life.